There exists a wound in history so deliberate, so complete, that for nearly 2,000 years, scholars questioned whether an entire civilization had ever truly existed at all. Carthage was not merely defeated, it was erased. Imagine a city that controlled the Mediterranean world. Picture merchant vessels bearing Carthaginian purple, sailing from the coasts of North Africa to Spain, to Sicily, to distant colonies scattered across an empire built not on legions, but on commerce and naval mastery. The Phoenicians who founded Carthage near present-day Tunis understood something Rome would spend centuries learning. Power flows through trade routes as surely as through conquered territories. By the 3rd century before Christ, Carthage had become something unprecedented. A republican state governed by merchant families, their wealth accumulated across generations of trade. Within the sprawling urban remains covering 3 to 5 kilometers, a sophisticated society flourished. Religious sites like the Tophet of Carthage stood as monuments to their beliefs, their urn burials telling stories of a people whose spiritual life remains partially mysterious to us still. Then came Hannibal. Then came 3 wars that would reshape the ancient world. Then came Rome's systematic, methodical, almost vengeful erasure of an entire civilization. What remains today are fragments, archaeological evidence, scattered accounts written by Roman historians who had every reason to distort the truth. Yet through these remnants, a remarkable story emerges, one of ambition, innovation, and the price of standing against an empire determined to dominate. The Mediterranean, in the early centuries of the 1st millennium before Christ, was not yet a Roman sea. It belonged instead to traders, to merchants who understood the wind and the current, to seafarers who mapped the shoreline through courage and calculation rather than imperial decree. Among these maritime peoples, one civilization rose with particular brilliance, establishing a commercial network so extensive that for nearly 3 centuries, no naval power could challenge their dominion over the Western Mediterranean's most profitable routes. This was Carthage, and to understand how completely history would erase her, we must first understand how magnificently she rose. The origins of Carthage reach back to the Phoenician city of Tyre, located in what is now Lebanon, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were merchants, craftspeople, and navigators whose reputation for commercial acumen spread throughout the ancient world. Around the year 814 before Christ, Phoenician settlers from Tyre established a colony on the coast of North Africa, on a peninsula extending into the Mediterranean near what is now Tunis, Tunisia. The name they gave their new settlement was Carthage, which in their Phoenician language meant new city. The Romans would later render this as Carthago. The Greeks knew it as Carchedon. The location chosen for this colony revealed the strategic vision of its founders. The peninsula where Carthage would develop possessed natural harbors on both its northern and southern coasts, providing shelter for merchant vessels and military ships alike. The terrain inland consisted of fertile plains ideal for agriculture, capable of supporting grain cultivation, olive groves, and vineyards. The Mediterranean climate brought mild, wet winters and hot, dry summers, conditions that sustained both the urban population and the extensive trade networks upon which Carthaginian prosperity would depend. The site offered what every successful colonial venture required: access to the sea, proximity to agricultural resources, and a defensible position from which to project power. In those early centuries following the colony's establishment, Carthage developed according to patterns established by Phoenician tradition. The settlement grew around a harbor district where merchant ships unloaded cargo from across the known world and loaded goods destined for distant ports. Phoenician merchants had long engaged in long-distance trade, exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials unavailable in their homeland. Silver came from Spain. Tin arrived from the distant regions of the Atlantic coast, essential for the bronze that armed warriors and equipped households. Ivory was procured from Africa. Amber, that fossilized resin prized for ornament and trade, reached Mediterranean markets through networks extending toward the Baltic. These goods flowed through Carthage, enriching the merchants who controlled the trade routes and the city that housed them. The Phoenicians brought with them not merely commercial practices, but also religious traditions and cultural institutions. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries by institutions including the French National Institute of Archaeology and Art have revealed the material evidence of Carthaginian religious life. At a site called the Tophet of Carthage, archaeologists discovered evidence of religious practice spanning centuries. Urns containing human remains, predominantly those of infants and young children, were buried in organized patterns alongside inscriptions in Phoenician script and votive offerings to the gods. The interpretation of this site remains one of archaeology's most contested questions. Some scholars, including Lawrence Steger in work published in 1995, have argued that the Tophet represents a site of ritual child sacrifice, a practice that would have been deeply shocking to later Roman sensibilities and contributed significantly to their portrayal of Carthaginians as barbaric. Other scholars, notably William Barker in 1999, have proposed that the Tophet functioned primarily as a cemetery for children who died from natural causes, a sacred space where the youngest members of the community were laid to rest. The evidence remains ambiguous, and responsible scholarship acknowledges this ambiguity rather than claiming certainty where none exists. What is clear from the archaeological record is that Carthaginian religious practice centered on worship of gods, including Baal-Hamon and Tanit, deities whose roots extended back to Phoenician tradition. Religious artifacts recovered from excavation sites, votive offerings, temple remains, and inscribed dedications reveal a community that understood itself as connected to divine forces and sought to propitiate those forces through organized religious practice. The religious institutions of Carthage were not separate from its commercial and political life, but thoroughly integrated with them, as was typical of ancient Mediterranean civilizations. As the centuries passed following Carthage's foundation, the city evolved from a colonial trading post into something far more substantial. By the 4th century before Christ, Carthage had become the dominant naval power of the Western Mediterranean. This transformation occurred not through conquest in the military sense, but through the accumulated weight of commercial success, maritime skill, and the ability to project power through naval vessels. The Carthaginian navy, drawing on Phoenician traditions of shipbuilding and seamanship, became legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. Their warships, swift and maneuverable, could be deployed to protect merchant convoys or to enforce Carthaginian interests in disputed waters. Archaeological investigations of shipwreck sites and harbor structures have provided physical evidence of Carthaginian naval technology, revealing vessels engineered with sophistication and built with materials selected for durability and performance. The political structure of Carthage itself remains a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians, including Dexter Hoyos in his extensive work on Carthaginian history, argue that Carthage operated as a republic, with power distributed among magistrates and a council of wealthy citizens. Other scholars suggest that Carthage's political system was more accurately characterized as oligarchic or possessed monarchic elements at various points in its history. What is indisputable is that Carthage was governed by an elite class of wealthy merchants and landowners who made decisions affecting the city's commercial and military policies. This elite class accumulated wealth through control of trade, ownership of agricultural land, and investment in maritime ventures. Their interests shaped the policies by which Carthage expanded its influence throughout the Mediterranean. The expansion of Carthaginian power during the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ followed patterns of commercial and strategic advantage rather than territorial conquest in the manner of later empires. The Carthaginians established colonies and trading posts along the coasts of North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. These settlements served multiple purposes. They provided secure harbors for merchant ships, allowed Carthaginians to control access to valuable resources, and extended Carthaginian cultural influence into regions previously dominated by Greek or Etruscan powers. The Balearic Islands, off the coast of Spain, became a major center of Carthaginian power and would later serve as a crucial base for military operations. In Spain, Carthaginian settlements provided access to the silver mines of the interior, resources of such value that control of Spanish territories became a central objective of Carthaginian strategy. The cultural achievements of Carthage during this period of expansion reflected the sophisticated civilization that had developed on the North African coast. Carthaginian merchants were famous throughout the Mediterranean for their commercial acumen and their willingness to trade with any people, regardless of political affiliation. Carthaginian craftspeople produced goods of high quality, including textiles, metalwork, and pottery. Carthaginian engineers designed and constructed the harbors, fortifications, and civic structures that made their cities functional and defensible. The architectural remains recovered by excavation reveal cities of considerable sophistication, with organized street plans, residential quarters, temples, and harbor installations designed with practical intelligence. The Phoenician script, from which the Carthaginian writing system derived, appears on inscriptions throughout Carthaginian territories. These inscriptions, preserved on stone and recovered by archaeologists, provide direct evidence of the language spoken by Carthaginians and the concerns that occupied their attention. Dedications to gods, records of commercial transactions, epitaphs honoring the dead. These documents reveal a literate civilization that valued written communication and maintained records of its activities. The ability to read and interpret these inscriptions has allowed modern scholars to understand Carthaginian society in its own terms, rather than solely through the hostile accounts of Roman writers who viewed Carthage as a rival and eventually as an enemy to be destroyed. The agricultural basis of Carthaginian prosperity, though often overshadowed by emphasis on maritime trade, was substantial and significant. The fertile plains of North Africa could produce grain surpluses that fed not only the urban population of Carthage itself, but also provided export goods for trade throughout the Mediterranean. Olive cultivation and viticulture, the growing of grapes for wine, were practiced extensively in Carthaginian territories. These agricultural products, processed and packaged for transport, became valuable trade commodities. The integration of agricultural production with maritime commerce created a diversified economic foundation that supported Carthage's rise to regional dominance. By the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, Carthage had established itself as the wealthiest and most powerful city in the western Mediterranean. Its merchant fleet was unmatched in size and capability. Its naval warships could be deployed to protect trade routes or to contest control of strategic waters. Its wealth was legendary, accumulated through centuries of commercial success. The city itself, covering approximately 3 to 5 square kilometers of urban development according to archaeological surveys, housed a population of perhaps several 100,000 at its peak. This was a metropolis by the standards of the ancient world, a center of commerce, culture, and political power. Yet this magnificent civilization, at the height of its influence and prosperity, would soon face a rival that would ultimately prove far more formidable than any power it had previously encountered. On the Italian peninsula, in the region called Latium, a city-state called Rome was expanding its influence with increasing aggressiveness. Rome had begun as a small settlement on the Tiber River, but had grown through military conquest to dominate the Italian peninsula. By the early 3rd century before Christ, Rome had defeated its rivals on the Italian peninsula and turned its attention toward expansion into the wider Mediterranean world. The collision between Roman ambition and Carthaginian dominance would generate 3 wars spanning more than a century, wars that would transform the Mediterranean and ultimately determine which civilization would emerge as the dominant power of the ancient world. This is where the story of Carthage enters its critical phase, the period in which the decisions made by Carthaginian leaders and the military campaigns they undertook would either secure Carthaginian dominance or open the door to catastrophic decline. The origins of Carthage, the rise from colonial trading post to Mediterranean superpower, represent an achievement of extraordinary magnitude. The merchants and sailors, the engineers and administrators, the ordinary people who built and maintained the city, they created something remarkable, a civilization of genuine sophistication and accomplishment. They could not have known that their city's greatest triumphs were already in the past, that the future held not continued expansion, but increasingly desperate struggle, and that ultimately, their civilization would be subjected to an erasure so complete that for nearly 2,000 years, scholars would question whether Carthage had truly existed at all. But this knowledge lay in the future. In the early 3rd century before Christ, Carthage stood at the apex of its power, wealthy, influential, and seemingly secure in its dominance of Western Mediterranean commerce and naval affairs. The decisions made in the coming decades, the wars that would be fought, and the commanders who would lead Carthaginian forces would determine whether this dominance could be maintained, or whether Rome's rising power would prove irresistible. From the founding settlement on that narrow peninsula around 814 before Christ, Carthage did not emerge as a superpower through conquest alone. It rose through something far more enduring, the systematic mastery of trade, the cultivation of colonies, and the development of a naval infrastructure that would dominate the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The Phoenician settlers who established the city brought with them not just the ambitions of merchants, but the accumulated knowledge of one of history's greatest seafaring peoples. The early centuries of Carthage's existence were marked by careful expansion. Archaeological evidence from excavations across the Mediterranean, from the coordinates of ancient Carthage itself at approximately 36.85 degrees north latitude and 10.33 degrees east longitude, extending across 3 to 5 square kilometers of urban remains, reveals a civilization that understood something fundamental about power in the ancient world. Control the sea routes, and you control wealth. Control wealth, and you control influence. The climate of the Mediterranean region during Carthage's rise was favorable for such ambitions. The mild, wet winters and hot, dry summers that characterized the region allowed for both agriculture and seafaring. Inland from Carthage's natural harbors stretched fertile plains ideal for growing grain, olives, and grapes. This agricultural foundation was crucial. A city could not build ships, maintain armies, or support a growing population without reliable food supplies. But Carthage understood that local production was only the beginning. The real wealth lay in connecting distant markets, in becoming the indispensable intermediary between the tin mines of Cornwall, the silver deposits of Spain, the ivory of Africa, and the wealthy markets of the eastern Mediterranean. The Carthaginian colonial system represents one of the most sophisticated economic networks of the ancient world. Unlike Rome's later approach to conquest, which emphasized territorial control and political integration, Carthage established a network of trading posts and colonies designed to secure resources and facilitate commerce. These settlements dotted the coastlines of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Iberian Peninsula. Each served a specific function within a larger economic strategy. Some were primarily agricultural, others were mining centers, and still others existed primarily as way stations for merchant vessels traveling between distant ports. This network was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate planning and sustained effort across generations. Carthaginian merchants and naval commanders understood the routes of the Mediterranean as intimately as a modern trader might understand global shipping lanes. They knew where the currents ran favorable, where pirates congregated, which harbors offered protection, and which cities offered the best markets for their goods. The artifacts recovered from archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean, silver coins, pottery, inscriptions in Phoenician script, and the remains of trading vessels, testify to the scale and sophistication of this commercial enterprise. The political structure that governed Carthage during this period remains somewhat contested among scholars. Some historians, including scholars such as Hoyos, have argued that Carthage operated according to a republican model with democratic elements, while others, including Lancel, suggest a more complex oligarchic or monarchic structure that evolved over time. What is clear from historical records is that Carthage was governed by powerful merchant families whose wealth derived directly from trade and naval commerce. These families competed for influence and power, and this competition sometimes led to internal conflict. Yet despite these tensions, the Carthaginian political system maintained sufficient stability to pursue long-term strategic objectives across centuries. One of the most important aspects of Carthaginian society was the role of the military, particularly the navy. The Carthaginian fleet was not merely a military instrument, it was an extension of commercial power. Every warship represented an investment in the protection of trade routes, the defense of colonies, and the projection of influence. Archaeological evidence of naval artifacts, shipwrecks, warship remains, and harbor structures reveals a civilization that invested heavily in maritime technology. The Carthaginians developed advanced shipbuilding techniques, created sophisticated harbor facilities, and trained professional sailors and naval commanders. These naval capabilities allowed them to maintain control over vast distances and to respond quickly to threats or opportunities. The religious and cultural life of Carthage during its rise reveals a civilization that, while maintaining its Phoenician identity, was also adapting to its new Mediterranean context. Archaeological excavations have uncovered religious artifacts related to Baal-Hamon and Tanit, deities central to Carthaginian religious practice. The famous Tophet of Carthage, a cemetery and religious site with urn burials located within the ancient city, continues to generate scholarly debate. Some scholars, including Steger in 1995, have interpreted the Tophet as evidence of child sacrifice, a practice that horrified Greek and Roman observers. Other scholars, including Barker in 1999, have suggested that the site functioned primarily as a cemetery for children who died from natural causes. Regardless of which interpretation proves correct, the Tophet represents a significant religious site where Carthaginians engaged in ritual practices and burial customs that reflected their worldview and values. The architectural remains of Carthage itself provide insight into urban development during this period of expansion. Systematic excavations conducted by the French National Institute of Archaeology and Art throughout the 20th century, continuing through more recent work in the 2000s through 2020s, have revealed the layout of residential quarters, temples, fortifications, and harbor facilities. These structures demonstrate that Carthage was not merely a trading post, but a genuine city with complex urban organization. Streets were planned, neighborhoods developed, and public spaces created. The harbor facilities themselves were engineering achievements designed to accommodate numerous vessels and facilitate the rapid loading and unloading of cargo. As Carthage expanded its colonial network and refined its commercial systems, the city accumulated wealth on an unprecedented scale. This wealth allowed for the maintenance of increasingly professional military forces and the support of a large urban population. By the 5th century before Christ, Carthage had become arguably the wealthiest city in the Western Mediterranean. Merchants from throughout the known world sought access to Carthaginian markets. The city's population grew, and with it came the need for increased food supplies, which in turn drove further expansion of the colonial and agricultural network. Yet this period of expansion was not without challenges. The Carthaginians faced competition from other Mediterranean powers, particularly the Greek city-states that had established colonies throughout Sicily and southern Italy. Conflicts over colonial territories, trade routes, and regional influence became increasingly common. The Carthaginians engaged in numerous military campaigns to defend and expand their colonial holdings. These campaigns, while often successful, required sustained military expenditure and sometimes resulted in setbacks. Archaeological evidence of fortifications and military installations throughout the Carthaginian colonial network reveals the extent to which the civilization invested in military infrastructure. The period from approximately the 6th century through the 3rd century before Christ represents the height of Carthaginian power and influence. During these centuries, Carthage established itself as the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian fleet patrolled trade routes, protected colonial territories, and projected power across vast distances. Carthaginian merchants grew wealthy beyond measure, and Carthaginian generals commanded respect and fear. The city itself became a cosmopolitan center where traders from numerous peoples and cultures met to exchange goods and information. This commercial and military dominance was not absolute or unchallenged. Rome, a city that had begun as a small settlement on the Italian peninsula, was itself beginning to expand its influence during this same period. Initially, Rome and Carthage maintained a relatively peaceful coexistence, with treaty arrangements that recognized Carthaginian dominance in the Western Mediterranean while allowing Roman influence to develop in Italy and the Adriatic. Yet the seeds of future conflict were being sown. As Rome grew stronger and began to expand beyond the Italian peninsula, it inevitably came into conflict with Carthaginian interests. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would ultimately determine which civilization would dominate the Mediterranean world. The Carthaginian response to Roman expansion reveals important aspects of Carthaginian strategic thinking. Rather than viewing Rome as an existential threat in the early stages of Roman expansion, Carthaginian leaders attempted to maintain the status quo through diplomatic arrangements and strategic alliances. This approach reflected the merchant mentality that had built Carthage's wealth and power. Trade and commerce could continue even between rivals if both parties benefited. Military conflict, from this perspective, represented a failure of commercial arrangement and should be avoided if possible. However, the fundamental interests of Carthage and Rome were increasingly incompatible. Rome's expansion into Sicily, an island that Carthage had long viewed as within its sphere of influence, created direct conflict. When Rome moved to extend its power into Sicily in the 3rd century before Christ, it crossed a line that Carthage could not tolerate. The Carthaginian colonial network depended on maintaining control over strategic territories and trade routes. Allowing Rome to dominate Sicily would represent a fundamental threat to Carthaginian power and prosperity. The response of Carthage to this challenge demonstrates both the strengths and, ultimately, the limitations of Carthaginian power. The Carthaginian government mobilized its considerable resources to resist Roman expansion. It deployed its superior navy, hired mercenary forces, and attempted to secure alliances with other Mediterranean powers opposed to Roman expansion. For a time, these efforts appeared to be working. Carthaginian forces achieved significant victories against Roman armies and fleets. Yet Rome, despite suffering defeats, possessed a crucial advantage, an apparently unlimited capacity to generate new armies and fleets. This fundamental difference in resources and strategic capacity would ultimately determine the outcome of the conflict between Carthage and Rome. Carthage, for all its wealth and naval superiority, was fundamentally a merchant civilization. Its power derived from trade and commerce, from the control of trade routes and the accumulation of wealth through exchange. Rome, by contrast, was fundamentally a military and political civilization. Its power derived from the ability to mobilize the resources of an entire peninsula for military purposes. Rome could sustain military losses and continue fighting. Carthage, dependent on maintaining commercial networks and colonial holdings, was more vulnerable to disruption. The military campaigns of this period, particularly the conflicts in Sicily and the Mediterranean, would eventually lead to the first major confrontation between Carthage and Rome. These conflicts, known to history as the Punic Wars, would define the fate of both civilizations. Yet before those wars began, Carthage stood at the apex of its power. The city controlled vast territories, commanded the most powerful navy in the world, and had accumulated wealth that seemed almost limitless. Carthaginian merchants traded throughout the known world. Carthaginian colonies stretched from the coasts of Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. Carthaginian generals commanded armies of tens of thousands of soldiers. The cultural achievements of Carthage during this period of expansion deserve recognition alongside its commercial and military accomplishments. Although much of Carthaginian literature and art has been lost, surviving inscriptions and artifacts reveal a civilization of considerable sophistication. Carthaginian merchants kept detailed records of their transactions. Carthaginian craftspeople created pottery, metalwork, and other artifacts of high quality. Carthaginian architects designed cities and harbor facilities that reflected advanced engineering knowledge. Carthaginian religious thinkers developed theological concepts and ritual practices that influenced the broader Mediterranean world. The society that Carthage had built by the 3rd century before Christ represented an extraordinary achievement. From a small Phoenician colony established 500 years earlier, Carthage had grown into a civilization of continental significance. Its wealth was legendary, its navy unmatched, its merchants ubiquitous throughout the Mediterranean world. The city itself had expanded into a major urban center, with harbors bustling with activity, markets filled with exotic goods, and temples dedicated to gods worshipped throughout the Carthaginian world. The population of Carthage and its dependent territories numbered in the hundreds of thousands, all connected by networks of trade, administration, and military organization. Yet this achievement, remarkable as it was, contained within it the seeds of future challenge and conflict. The very success of Carthage's commercial model had attracted the attention of Rome, a civilization with different values and different strategic objectives. Where Carthage sought to maintain trade networks and commercial dominance, Rome sought territorial control and political hegemony. These two visions of Mediterranean order were ultimately incompatible. The rise of Carthage to the apex of Mediterranean power had taken 5 centuries of sustained effort, careful planning, and strategic adaptation. Yet the challenges that now confronted Carthage would test whether a merchant civilization could survive when confronted by a military civilization determined to expand its power. The period of Carthage's rise represents one of the great achievements of the ancient Mediterranean world. A small Phoenician colony had grown into a superpower through intelligence, innovation, and sustained effort. Carthaginian merchants had created trading networks that spanned thousands of miles. Carthaginian naval commanders had built a fleet that dominated the Mediterranean. Carthaginian generals had conquered territories and defended colonial holdings across vast distances. The wealth accumulated by Carthage seemed to guarantee its future security and prosperity. Yet history would soon demonstrate that wealth and naval power alone were insufficient to guarantee survival when confronted by an adversary with different capabilities and different strategic objectives. The rise of Carthage had been remarkable, but the challenges that lay ahead would test the civilization in ways that its merchant founders could scarcely have imagined. The 3rd century before Christ arrived as a turning point in the Mediterranean world, though few recognized it at the moment. Carthage had reached its apex as a commercial and naval power, its trading networks extending from the coasts of Spain to the shorelines of North Africa, its merchant vessels familiar in every major port, from Gades to the Levantine coast. Yet prosperity, history teaches us repeatedly, can blind a civilization to the emergence of rivals. Rome, that city built on 7 hills far from the sea, had been consolidating its own power with methodical determination. Where Carthage had grown through trade and the establishment of colonies across the Mediterranean basin, Rome had expanded through conquest and the incorporation of Italian territories into a unified political structure. By the beginning of the 3rd century, Rome controlled the Italian peninsula and had begun to cast its gaze outward toward the islands and territories that Carthage considered its natural sphere of influence. The collision between these two powers was not inevitable, though it would prove to be irresistible once set in motion. The trigger came not from grand strategic calculations, but from the mundane complexities of regional politics. Sicily, that large and fertile island positioned strategically between the Italian mainland and North Africa, became the flashpoint. The island had long been divided between Greek city-states in the east and Carthaginian interests in the west, a balance that had held for generations. But when internal conflicts erupted within Sicily, both Rome and Carthage found themselves drawn into local disputes, each supporting different factions, each unable to resist the opportunity to expand influence. The First Punic War, which began around 264 before Christ, would last for more than 2 decades and transform the Mediterranean world fundamentally. The very name of these conflicts, the Punic Wars, derived from the Latin word for Phoenician, revealed the essential nature of the struggle. Rome and Carthage were not merely competing for territory or resources. They were engaged in a collision between 2 entirely different models of power and civilization. Carthage projected influence through naval dominance and commercial networks. Rome built its power through military legions and territorial conquest. The war itself was grueling and expensive for both sides. Carthage, despite its naval superiority, found itself disadvantaged in this conflict because Rome, learning quickly from Carthaginian tactics, began building a formidable navy of its own. The construction of warships required resources and determination, but Rome possessed both. Archaeological evidence and historical records indicate that Rome constructed and deployed hundreds of vessels during the course of the conflict, a massive commitment of resources and labor that demonstrated the Republic's willingness to compete on any battlefield necessary. The Carthaginian response to Roman military expansion was to consolidate their position in other territories. Unable to defeat Rome decisively in Sicily, Carthaginian leaders turned their attention to Spain, a land rich in mineral resources and suitable for recruitment of warrior populations. It was during this period that the Barcid family, a prominent Carthaginian dynasty, began to establish what amounted to a personal empire in Iberian territories. Hamilcar Barca, a renowned Carthaginian general, led military campaigns in Spain with the explicit goal of creating a power base independent of Carthage itself, though nominally subject to the Carthaginian state. The First Punic War ended in 241 before Christ with a Carthaginian defeat. Rome imposed harsh terms on the vanquished Carthaginians, demanding indemnities and territorial concessions. Carthage lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, islands that had been central to its commercial network and strategic position. For a civilization built on maritime trade, this represented a profound diminishment of power and influence. Yet rather than capitulating entirely, the Carthaginian leadership recognized an opportunity in Spain. The expansion into Spain under Hamilcar Barca and his son-in-law Hasdrubal represented a deliberate strategy of compensation. If Carthage could not compete with Rome in the central Mediterranean, it would build an alternative power base in the western Mediterranean and in Iberia itself. Archaeological evidence from Spanish sites confirms the extent of Carthaginian settlement and military infrastructure established during this period. Fortifications, temples, and residential quarters testify to a substantial Carthaginian presence in Spanish territories. The city of Cartagena, or Carthago Nova as it was known, became a major Carthaginian stronghold, strategically positioned to control trade routes and serve as a military base. It was into this context of Carthaginian expansion and Roman consolidation that Hannibal Barca emerged. Born around 247 before Christ, Hannibal would become perhaps the most famous military commander of the ancient Mediterranean world, a figure whose name would echo through centuries of military strategy and historical reflection. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, and he inherited not merely a position of military command, but a vision of Carthaginian revival. According to historical sources, Hannibal's father brought the young boy to Spain and made him swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome, a dramatic moment that captured the essence of the conflict that would define his life. When Hannibal assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Spain around 221 before Christ, he immediately began expanding Carthaginian territorial control in the peninsula. His campaigns were marked by military brilliance and strategic insight. He conquered cities, subdued resistant populations, and accumulated resources and warriors for what he clearly envisioned as a confrontation with Rome itself. The Roman Senate, observing these developments with growing concern, attempted to establish agreements with Carthaginian authorities that would limit Carthaginian expansion in Spain. These diplomatic efforts, however, ultimately proved insufficient to prevent the collision that both powers seemed to recognize as inevitable. The Second Punic War, which commenced in 218 before Christ, became the defining conflict of the ancient Mediterranean and would establish patterns of warfare and strategy that influenced military thinking for centuries to come. Hannibal's strategy was audacious and unconventional. Rather than attempting to defeat Rome by controlling the Mediterranean Sea, he proposed to carry the war directly into Italy itself, striking at Rome's heartland and threatening its territorial control. To accomplish this extraordinary objective, he conceived of a plan that seemed almost impossible to execute. Hannibal would march an army from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy. He would bring with him not merely soldiers, but also war elephants, creatures that European populations had rarely encountered and that possessed both practical and psychological value in ancient warfare. The very audacity of the plan was itself a kind of strategic brilliance. Rome's military leaders assumed that the Alps themselves would prove an insurmountable barrier, that no general would attempt such a journey. Yet in 218 before Christ, Hannibal began his march. Historical records and later accounts describe the journey in considerable detail, though some specifics remain subjects of scholarly debate. The journey across the Alps was catastrophic in its losses. Soldiers perished from cold, hunger, and disease. Elephants died in the mountain passes. The army that arrived in Italy was substantially smaller than the force that had departed Spain. Yet it arrived nonetheless, and it arrived in Italian territory, a fact that shattered Rome's assumption of geographic security. The campaigns that followed demonstrated Hannibal's genius as a military tactician. He understood Roman military strategy and adapted his own approaches accordingly. He studied the terrain, positioned his forces with meticulous care, and engaged in battles where his tactical innovations could overcome Roman numerical advantages. At Trebia in 218 before Christ, at Lake Trasimene in 217 before Christ, and most famously at Cannae in 216 before Christ, Hannibal defeated Roman armies in battles that demonstrated his superior understanding of warfare. At Cannae particularly, Hannibal's double envelopment tactic, in which Roman forces were surrounded and destroyed, became the textbook example of tactical brilliance that military academies would study for centuries to come. For more than a decade, Hannibal maintained his position in Italy, receiving supplies from Carthage and recruiting additional forces from Italian territories dissatisfied with Roman rule. Archaeological evidence and historical records indicate that substantial portions of southern Italy either defected to Hannibal or remained neutral, unwilling to continue supporting Rome's military efforts. The Carthaginian general had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had brought the war to Rome's homeland and sustained it there. Yet Rome possessed resources and determination that matched Hannibal's tactical brilliance. The Roman Senate, despite suffering catastrophic military defeats, refused to negotiate peace with Carthage. Rome appointed new military commanders, most notably Scipio Africanus, who studied Hannibal's methods and developed counter-strategies. Rather than confronting Hannibal directly in Italy, Scipio carried the war to Carthage's territories in Spain and North Africa, forcing Hannibal to abandon his Italian campaigns and return to defend his homeland. The final confrontation between Hannibal and Scipio occurred at Zama in 202 before Christ in North African territories. The battle resulted in a Carthaginian defeat, though Hannibal's tactical skill remained evident even in defeat. The Second Punic War concluded with Carthage again forced to accept harsh terms of peace. Carthage was required to pay enormous indemnities, to surrender its remaining Spanish territories to Rome, and to accept severe limitations on its military capabilities. Throughout this period, the city of Carthage itself continued to function as a center of trade and commercial activity. Archaeological evidence from excavations conducted by the French National Institute of Archaeology and Art and other institutions confirms that the urban areas of Carthage, including residential quarters, commercial districts, and religious sanctuaries, remained active and developed during these decades of military conflict. The Tophet of Carthage, that sacred precinct dedicated to religious purposes, continued to function as a center of religious devotion. Scholars continue to debate whether the urns and remains found at the Tophet represent evidence of ritual child sacrifice, as some interpretations suggest, or whether they represent a cemetery for children who died of natural causes, as other scholarly analyses propose. These debates reflect the complexity of interpreting archaeological evidence and the challenge of understanding religious practices that differ substantially from modern perspectives. The decades between the Second and Third Punic Wars represented a period of recovery for Carthage. Despite the harsh terms imposed by Rome, the city's commercial networks remained largely intact. Carthaginian merchants continued to trade throughout the Mediterranean, and the city accumulated wealth and resources once more. This recovery itself became a source of concern to Rome. Roman political leaders, particularly those who advocated an aggressive foreign policy, viewed Carthage's revival as a threat to Roman supremacy. The famous orator Cato repeatedly warned the Roman Senate that Carthage must be destroyed, concluding his speeches with the phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 before Christ, represented Rome's final effort to eliminate Carthage as a power in the Mediterranean. This war was different in character from the previous conflicts. Hannibal had died years earlier, and Carthage no longer possessed a military commander of equivalent brilliance. The war became a siege, with Roman forces gradually surrounding and strangling the city. The siege lasted approximately 3 years, and historical accounts describe the suffering of the civilian population as food supplies dwindled and disease spread within the besieged city. In 146 before Christ, Roman forces breached the city's defenses and entered Carthage itself. What followed was the systematic destruction of the city. Buildings were burned, walls were demolished, and the population was either killed or enslaved. Archaeological evidence confirms the extent of this destruction. Layers of ash and burned debris mark the final period of Carthage's existence as an independent city. The Roman Senate, according to historical sources, issued a decree that the site of Carthage should be cursed, that salt should be sown in its fields so that nothing could grow there, that the very name should be forgotten. This decree, though not carried out with complete effectiveness, represented an intention toward total erasure. Yet erasure, history has taught us repeatedly, is never complete. The story of Carthage did not end in 146 before Christ. It merely transformed into a different kind of existence, one lived in the fragments and remains that would survive beneath the earth, waiting for future generations of scholars and archaeologists to uncover them and restore them to historical memory. The stage was set, though the actors did not yet fully comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. By the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, the Mediterranean world stood at a precipice. On one side lay the established order, the intricate web of trade routes and colonial holdings that Carthage had woven across the sea. On the other side lay something entirely new, the emergence of Rome as not merely a regional Italian power, but as a force that would reshape the entire balance of power in the ancient world. The first collision between these two civilizations came not through grand declaration or formal declaration of war, but through the mundane reality of commerce and territorial ambition. Sicily, that fertile island bridging the gap between the Italian peninsula and North Africa, became the flashpoint. For generations, Carthage had maintained a presence there, controlling the western portions, while Greek city-states held the eastern regions. Rome, consolidating its power over the Italian mainland, now looked outward with hungry eyes. The island represented not merely wealth, but strategic positioning, the ability to project power across the central Mediterranean. When conflict erupted in 264 before Christ, few recognized it as the beginning of a struggle that would consume nearly a century and fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization. The First Punic War, as history would come to know it, began with what seemed like a local dispute, a quarrel between mercenaries and local populations that escalated into something far greater. Yet this first conflict revealed something crucial. Rome and Carthage did not compete in the same arena. Carthage was supreme upon the waters. The Carthaginian navy, built across generations of maritime dominance and refined through countless trading expeditions, represented the most formidable naval force the Mediterranean had yet produced. Their warships, the quinqueremes with their multiple rows of oars, were engineering marvels that cut through the sea with practiced efficiency. Carthaginian sailors understood the winds and currents as intimately as farmers understood tin soil. They had sailed to the Atlantic coasts of Iberia and Africa, had navigated the treacherous waters around Sicily and Crete, and had built a commercial empire dependent entirely upon their ability to control the sea lanes. Rome, by contrast, was a land power. Its legions were legendary, disciplined formations of infantry that could march across terrain and overwhelm opponents through sheer tactical superiority and organizational brilliance. But Rome had no navy to speak of, no tradition of maritime warfare, no fleet capable of challenging Carthage's dominance of the waters. This fundamental mismatch should have meant swift Carthaginian victory. Instead, the First Punic War unfolded as a grinding, terrible conflict that would last 23 years and cost both civilizations immeasurably. Rome responded to its naval weakness with characteristic pragmatism and determination. They studied Carthaginian warship design, captured vessels, and built their own fleet with astonishing speed and scale, what Carthage had spent generations perfecting. Rome replicated in a matter of years, then improved upon through sheer numerical advantage and the tactical innovations of commanders like Gaius Duilius. The war dragged on with battles at sea and costly campaigns in Sicily. The island became a grinding war of attrition, with neither side able to deliver the knockout blow that would end the conflict decisively. Mercenary armies, supplied by Carthage, fought against Roman legions. Naval engagements saw thousands of men perish in the waters off Sicily and the Italian coast. The financial cost mounted relentlessly for both powers, draining treasuries and depleting resources that could have been invested in other endeavors. By 241 before Christ, exhaustion had set in on both sides. Carthage, facing financial crisis and unable to maintain its military commitments, sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered its holdings in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, the very islands that had formed the backbone of its western Mediterranean dominance. These territories, the fruits of generations of expansion and consolidation, were now lost. Rome demanded an enormous indemnity, a financial penalty so severe that it took Carthage decades to pay. Yet this defeat, catastrophic as it was, did not destroy Carthage. The civilization that had flourished for nearly 6 centuries through trade and commercial enterprise was wounded, but not fatal. What it did do was crystallize something in the Carthaginian consciousness. The old way of operating, the reliance upon naval dominance and commercial control, was no longer sufficient. A new threat had emerged that could not be negotiated with or accommodated through the subtle mechanisms of trade and influence. It was in this context of crisis and reassessment that Hannibal Barca rose to prominence. The historical sources present him as one of history's greatest military commanders, a figure whose tactical genius and strategic vision would reshape warfare itself. Born in 247 before Christ, Hannibal came of age in the aftermath of Carthage's humiliation. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had been a successful general during the latter stages of the First Punic War, one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dismal conflict for Carthage. After the war's conclusion, Hamilcar Barca undertook a remarkable project: the rebuilding of Carthaginian power in Iberia, on the Iberian Peninsula far to the west. The territories there, rich in mineral resources and populated by peoples who could be recruited as soldiers, offered Carthage a new power base. While Rome had taken the islands of the central Mediterranean, Carthage would rebuild its strength on the mainland of Spain, creating what amounted to a new empire within an empire. Young Hannibal was educated in this context, trained not merely in the arts of war, but in the philosophy of survival and resurgence. He learned from his father's example and from the bitter lessons of the First Punic War. When Hamilcar died around 220 before Christ, command of the Spanish forces passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then, when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 before Christ, to Hannibal himself. At approximately 25 years of age, Hannibal took command of Carthage's forces in Iberia. What he inherited was not merely an army, but a vision of how Carthage might reclaim its position as a great power. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused on building wealth through trade and commerce, Hannibal understood that the new Mediterranean world required military strength. Rome had demonstrated this truth conclusively during the First Punic War. If Carthage was to survive, let alone prosper, it would need to project military power that could match and exceed Rome's own. Over the next several years, Hannibal expanded Carthaginian control throughout Iberia with remarkable speed and efficiency. His armies grew, recruited from the indigenous populations, and hardened through constant campaigning. Archaeological evidence and ancient sources confirm the scope of this expansion. Carthaginian influence spread across the peninsula, with new territories bringing both manpower and resources into Carthage's orbit. The city on the coast of modern Tunisia, located at approximately 36.85 degrees north latitude and 10.33 degrees east longitude, now had a secure base of operations thousands of miles away, a vast hinterland from which to draw strength. This expansion did not go unnoticed in Rome. The Senate watched with growing alarm as Hannibal consolidated his power and built what appeared to be a formidable military machine. Envoys were sent, negotiations conducted, and agreements made regarding spheres of influence. The Ebro River was established as a boundary. Carthage would not expand beyond it. Rome would respect Carthaginian dominance to the south and west. It was an attempt to manage the inevitable tensions between two great powers sharing the same sea. But these diplomatic arrangements, born of mutual recognition of the other's strength, carried within them the seeds of conflict. Both Rome and Carthage understood that they could not coexist indefinitely as equals. One would eventually dominate the other. The question was not whether conflict would come, but when, and under what circumstances. The crisis point arrived in 219 before Christ, when Hannibal, acting with apparent deliberation, besieged the city of Saguntum on the eastern coast of Iberia. Saguntum was technically within the sphere of Carthaginian influence as defined by the Ebro River Treaty, yet the city had developed close ties to Rome. The siege itself was a masterpiece of military engineering and patience. Hannibal surrounded the city, cut off its supply lines, and subjected it to a prolonged assault that lasted 8 months. The inhabitants, rather than surrender, chose to perish. Ancient sources describe scenes of mass suicide as the final defenders. Recognized that no relief would come from Rome, that they would be left to face Carthage alone. The destruction of Saguntum sent shockwaves through both civilizations. For Rome, it was an intolerable act of defiance, a direct challenge to Roman authority, and a demonstration that Hannibal had no intention of respecting the boundaries established by treaty. For Carthage's government, it was both a military triumph and a political crisis. Hannibal had acted with apparent autonomy, making decisions of war and peace without explicit authorization from Carthage's leadership. Yet he had also presented the Carthaginian state with a fait accompli. The city was destroyed, Roman anger was provoked, and war was now inevitable. The Second Punic War began in 218 before Christ, though the exact declaration and formal commencement remain somewhat uncertain in the historical record. What is clear is that Rome, having recognized the threat that Hannibal represented, mobilized its considerable resources for a conflict it believed it would win decisively. Rome had recovered from its naval weakness of the First Punic War and now possessed a powerful fleet. More importantly, Rome controlled the Italian peninsula and could draw upon its vast reserves of manpower and wealth. Hannibal, however, had conceived a strategy so audacious that it remains studied in military academies to this day. Rather than defending Carthaginian territories in Iberia or attempting to contest Roman naval superiority in the Mediterranean, Hannibal would carry the war to Rome itself. He would march his armies across the Iberian Peninsula, over the Pyrenees Mountains, through the lands of Gaul, and across the Alps into Italy itself. There, in the heartland of Roman power, he would challenge Rome's legions directly and attempt to break apart the alliance system upon which Rome's dominance depended. The audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. No major military power had ever attempted such a feat. The logistics alone seemed impossible, moving tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of horses, and reportedly even war elephants across hundreds of miles of hostile or uncertain terrain, maintaining supply lines, and keeping an army cohesive and ready for battle. Yet Hannibal, demonstrating the organizational brilliance and strategic vision that would define his career, executed this plan with remarkable success. The crossing of the Alps in 218 before Christ, during the autumn and early winter months, remains one of history's most celebrated military achievements. Ancient sources, particularly Livy and Polybius, describe the horrors of the passage. Soldiers struggling through snow and ice, treacherous mountain paths that offered no room for error, indigenous peoples attacking the column, and the constant threat of collapse and disaster. Hannibal's army, which had numbered perhaps 40,000 soldiers and cavalry when it began the journey, arrived in Italy reduced in numbers but intact and ready for battle. The appearance of a Carthaginian army in Italy itself sent shockwaves through Roman society. For generations, Rome had been expanding outward from its heartland, conquering and incorporating neighboring peoples. The idea that an enemy army could march into the peninsula itself, that Rome's homeland was vulnerable to invasion, shattered assumptions about Roman invulnerability. Yet this crisis, this turning point where Carthage seemed poised to strike a devastating blow against Rome, would ultimately prove to be not the beginning of Carthage's triumph, but rather the start of a long decline. Hannibal would spend the next 15 years in Italy, winning remarkable victories against Roman armies and demonstrating military genius that commanders studied for centuries to come. Yet despite his tactical brilliance, despite victories like Cannae in 216 before Christ, where he destroyed a Roman army of perhaps 80,000 soldiers, Hannibal could not deliver the knockout blow that would have ended Roman resistance. Rome's system of alliances held, its ability to raise new armies proved seemingly inexhaustible, and its strategic patience outlasted Carthage's resources. This was the crisis point, the turning point where Carthage's fate began to be sealed. Not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through the slow realization that Rome possessed resources and resilience that Carthage could not overcome. The old empire, built on trade and naval dominance, had committed itself to a land war against an opponent perfectly suited to such conflict. And in that commitment, in that fundamental mismatch between Carthage's strengths and the demands of the conflict it had chosen, lay the seeds of eventual destruction. The fires that consumed Carthage in 146 before Christ did not merely destroy a city. They erased, or so Rome intended, an entire world from the consciousness of subsequent civilizations. The victorious legions under Scipio Aemilianus left behind only ruins and silence, a deliberate obliteration so thorough that for nearly 2 millennia, Carthage existed primarily as a footnote in Roman histories written by the victors themselves. Yet history, it seems, possesses a stubborn resilience. The very ground of North Africa, the soil that once nourished the greatest naval power the Mediterranean had ever known, retained the memory of what had stood there. It waited, patient and faithful, for those with the curiosity and skill to listen to its whispered testimony. The destruction itself was methodical. After a 3-year siege that ground the city into submission, Roman forces systematically dismantled Carthage's physical presence. They burned the buildings, destroyed the fortifications, and scattered the population. The harbor structures that had once represented the pinnacle of Phoenician maritime engineering were rendered useless. The markets where merchants from 3 continents had gathered to exchange goods fell silent. The temples dedicated to Baal Hammon and Tanit, the deities who had watched over Carthaginian prosperity, were leveled. Roman historians, most notably Livy and Polybius, recorded these events, but their accounts were filtered through the lens of Roman triumph. They described the fall of an enemy, not the extinction of a civilization. In their telling, Carthage was simply an obstacle removed from Rome's path to destiny. What made this erasure particularly profound was not merely the physical destruction, but the narrative annihilation that followed. For generations, the story of Carthage was told exclusively through Roman sources. When the city's name appeared in historical accounts, it appeared as a cautionary tale, a civilization that had challenged Rome and paid the ultimate price. The Carthaginians themselves became almost mythological in Roman imagination, wealthy merchants driven by greed, treacherous allies, enemies of civilization itself. Hannibal, their greatest general, was remembered not for his tactical genius or his courage, but as a barbaric threat to Roman order. The sophisticated trading networks that had connected Carthage to civilizations across the known world were reduced to simple narratives of commerce and conquest. The cultural achievements of Carthaginian society, its literature, its philosophy, its artistic traditions, were rendered invisible. Yet beneath the ruins of Carthage, evidence remained. The Mediterranean soil, rich with the accumulated layers of centuries of habitation, held fast to the material remnants of Carthaginian civilization. It was not until the 19th century that systematic archaeological attention turned toward recovering these buried truths. French archaeologists, beginning with Alfred Louis Delattre in the 19th century, recognized that the peninsula near modern Tunis, located at coordinates approximately 36.85 degrees north latitude and 10.33 degrees east longitude, held the physical remains of an entire world. These early excavations were tentative, often conducted with methods that would be considered crude by modern standards, yet they revealed something startling. Carthage had been real. It had been vast. It had been sophisticated. The archaeological record gradually began to tell a different story from the Roman one. Systematic excavations conducted throughout the 20th century by institutions such as the French National Institute of Archaeology and Art revealed an urban center that covered approximately 3 to 5 square kilometers of ancient remains. The harbor structures spoke of advanced engineering knowledge. The residential quarters showed evidence of organized urban planning. The fortifications, though destroyed, bore witness to the military resources that had been required to maintain Carthaginian independence. Most significantly, artifacts began to emerge that testified to the breadth of Carthaginian influence and trade. Silver from Spain, tin from Britain, ivory from Africa, and goods from West African sources filled storage areas and merchant warehouses. These were not the possessions of a simple military power, but of a civilization that had woven itself into the commercial fabric of the entire Mediterranean world. Among the most significant archaeological sites within ancient Carthage was the Tophet, a location that has fascinated and puzzled modern scholars. This cemetery and religious site contained hundreds of urn burials, evidence of ritualistic practices that have sparked considerable scholarly debate. Some researchers, following interpretations developed by scholars such as Stager in 1995, have argued that the Tophet represents evidence of child sacrifice, a practice that would have been abhorrent to Roman sensibilities and perhaps contributed to Roman determination to destroy Carthaginian civilization. Other scholars, notably Barker in 1999, have countered that the Tophet was primarily a cemetery for children who died naturally, a sacred burial ground for the young who did not survive to adulthood. This scholarly debate remains unresolved, yet it illustrates how the archaeological record continues to complicate our understanding of Carthaginian society, revealing a civilization more complex and perhaps more alien to modern sensibilities than simple narratives of commerce and warfare might suggest. The artifacts themselves became voices from the past, speaking across the centuries with remarkable clarity. Punic inscriptions in the distinctive Phoenician script emerged from excavation sites, offering glimpses into the religious devotions, commercial transactions, and administrative functions of Carthaginian society. Naval artifacts, including the remains of warships and shipwrecks, testified to the maritime dominance that had made Carthage wealthy and powerful. Religious artifacts related to the worship of Baal Hammon and Tanit revealed the spiritual dimensions of Carthaginian life. Architectural remains, fortifications, harbors, temples, and residential quarters provided physical evidence of urban organization and cultural values. Each artifact was a fragment of testimony, and collectively, they began to reconstruct a portrait of a civilization that Rome had tried to erase. The geographical and environmental context of Carthage's location proved crucial to understanding both its rise and its ultimate vulnerability. Situated on the coast of modern Tunisia, on a peninsula with natural harbors opening onto the Mediterranean Sea, Carthage enjoyed geographic advantages that had attracted Phoenician settlers around 814 before Christ. The terrain included fertile plains inland, ideal for agriculture, which could support an expanding urban population. The Mediterranean climate, mild and wet in winter, hot and dry in summer, favored the cultivation of grain, olives, and grapes, crops that both fed the city and provided goods for trade. The strategic maritime access to the Strait of Sicily positioned Carthage as a natural hub for commerce connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. Yet this same geography that had made Carthage wealthy also made it vulnerable. The city was ultimately dependent on naval supremacy to maintain its far-flung trading networks and to defend against rivals. When Rome challenged that naval dominance and proved superior in sustained maritime warfare, Carthage's geographic advantages became liabilities. The decline of Carthage was not sudden, but gradual, a process that unfolded across the 3 Punic Wars spanning more than a century. Each conflict drained resources and weakened Carthaginian power. The First Punic War, fought from 264 to 241 before Christ, demonstrated that Rome could match Carthaginian naval capabilities and was willing to invest the resources necessary to do so. The Second Punic War, during which Hannibal achieved his legendary victories at Cannae and elsewhere, ultimately ended in Carthaginian defeat, as Rome's resources and manpower proved superior to Carthaginian tactical brilliance. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 before Christ, was less a military conflict than a systematic Roman campaign to eliminate Carthage as a political and military force. By the time the walls of Carthage finally fell in 146 before Christ, the city had been reduced from a great power to a desperate, besieged stronghold. The aftermath of destruction, however, did not mean the complete disappearance of Carthaginian civilization. In the centuries following the city's fall, Roman colonists gradually returned to the site. The peninsula was too valuable, too strategically located, too economically important to remain abandoned. A new city, Roman in character and governance, rose on the ruins of the old. Yet something of Carthaginian culture persisted beneath the surface. The indigenous North African peoples who had lived alongside Carthage, who had traded with Carthaginian merchants and absorbed Carthaginian cultural influences, maintained certain traditions and practices. The exact extent of Carthaginian cultural assimilation with these indigenous North African peoples remains a matter of scholarly debate, yet archaeological evidence suggests that Carthaginian influence on the region was profound and lasting. It was not until the 20th century, and particularly in its later decades and into the 21st century, that archaeological efforts truly accelerated to recover and understand Carthaginian civilization. Excavations conducted from the 2000s onward have focused systematically on urban layout, harbor structures, and detailed analysis of sites such as the Tophet. These recent investigations have refined understanding of Carthaginian maritime technology, revealing sophisticated approaches to harbor construction, ship design, and naval logistics. They have illuminated the details of daily life in a great ancient city, showing how merchants lived alongside craftspeople, how families organized their homes, how religious practice was woven into the fabric of daily existence. They have demonstrated that Carthage was not merely a military or commercial power, but a complete civilization with distinct cultural traditions, artistic achievements, and intellectual accomplishments. The recovery of Carthaginian history represents something far more profound than the simple accumulation of archaeological data. It represents a fundamental challenge to the narrative that Rome had attempted to impose on history itself. By erasing Carthage from memory, Rome had not merely destroyed a rival power, it had attempted to control the very story of the past. The archaeological rediscovery of Carthage demonstrates that the past cannot be fully erased, that material evidence persists even when written records are suppressed or distorted, and that truth, though it may be buried and forgotten for centuries, can ultimately be recovered through patient, careful investigation. The ruins of Carthage, excavated and studied by generations of scholars, have become voices testifying to a civilization that Rome tried to silence. The legacy of Carthage extends beyond archaeology and historical understanding. The city's fate became a cautionary tale that echoed through subsequent centuries. The phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, attributed to the Roman senator Cato, came to represent the ruthlessness of Roman imperial ambition. Yet in later centuries, as people reflected on Carthage's fate, the city also became a symbol of cultural loss, of the dangers of allowing victors to write history unchallenged, of the importance of preserving and honoring civilizations different from our own. Carthage represented a different way of organizing society, a different approach to commerce and governance, a different set of cultural values and artistic traditions. Its destruction represented not merely military victory, but cultural erasure on a scale that was perhaps unprecedented in the ancient world. The modern city of Tunis, which stands near the site of ancient Carthage, carries the ghost of that earlier metropolis within its geography and culture. Visitors to the region can walk through archaeological sites where Carthaginian streets once bustled with merchants and soldiers, where temples rose toward the Mediterranean sky, where harbors filled with the ships that carried Carthaginian wealth across the known world. The artifacts recovered from these excavations now reside in museums, where they are preserved and studied, where they testify to a civilization that once was. The Carthaginian script, the religious objects, the tools of commerce, the weapons of war, all these fragments to speak across the centuries, offering testimony to a people who lived, worked, created, and died in a world that Rome attempted to erase from memory. The story of Carthage's rediscovery is ultimately a story about the resilience of historical truth. Despite Rome's efforts to control the narrative, despite centuries of silence and forgetting, the material evidence of Carthaginian civilization persisted. The soil of North Africa retained the memory of what had stood there. Archaeological investigation, conducted with increasing sophistication and care over more than a century, has gradually reconstructed the portrait of a civilization that had been nearly lost. We now understand Carthage not merely as Rome's great rival, but as a distinct civilization with its own achievements, its own values, its own complex internal history. The fall of Carthage reminds us that historical narratives are fragile, that they can be shaped and controlled by those with power, and that the pursuit of historical truth requires constant vigilance and skepticism toward established accounts. It reminds us that civilizations can be erased not merely through military defeat, but through the suppression of memory and the control of narrative. Yet it also offers hope, suggesting that truth, though it may be buried and forgotten, can ultimately be recovered. The archaeological sites of Carthage, the artifacts preserved in museums, the scholarly investigations that continue to illuminate Carthaginian civilization, all these represent a triumph of truth over attempted erasure. Today, Carthage exists not as the great maritime power it once was, not as the commercial hub that connected Mediterranean civilizations, but as a presence in the historical record and in the soil of North Africa. It exists in the scholarly literature that continues to debate the nature of Carthaginian society, in the artifacts that museums preserve and display, in the excavation sites that archaeologists continue to investigate. Most importantly, Carthage exists in our understanding of what it means to be a civilization, what it means to be remembered or forgotten, and what it takes to recover a history that has been nearly lost. The nightmare that Carthage represented to Rome, a powerful rival that challenged Roman dominance, has been transformed through the lens of history into something different, a mirror in which we can see the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of preserving diverse human achievements, and the stubborn persistence of historical truth against all efforts at suppression. The legacy of Carthage is not ultimately one of destruction and loss, though those elements are certainly part of the story. It is rather a legacy of irrecoverable, of the triumph of evidence over erasure, of the affirmation that history cannot be fully controlled by those who hold power in any given moment. Carthage stands as a testament to the complexity of the ancient Mediterranean world, to the sophistication of civilizations that existed beyond the boundaries of Rome, and to the enduring human desire to understand and preserve the stories of those who came before us. In recovering Carthage from the dust of centuries, we recover something essential about ourselves and about our relationship to history and truth.